Hello and welcome to I Can't Believe It's Not the Mouse, the podcast all about animation not made by the mouse. I'm your host, Octaviano, and today I figured I'd talk about the anime feature film Suzume. Now, when it comes to anime, I have a rocky relationship with it. I do like a lot of anime, but there is quite a lot that I just don't care for. Realistically, my issues with it is not really anime itself, it's just a lot of the culture around it, at least here in America. You do have a lot of passionate fans, and that's great. Totally understand. But then you got the people who are, I mean, I guess this is with any fandom, but my general thing with a lot of anime is that it feels like a lot of people who are super into it, I mean, as mean as it sounds to say, are kind of annoying. And again, it's not necessarily anime's fault on that. It's people's. But my main issue, like, whether it's... Because, realistically, a lot of fandoms have their annoying people. With Star Wars, it's pretty much anyone who just can't get over the most smallest of things, like whether it's the changes to the original movies or, much worse things, like okay, you got the defenders of the bad movies, the people who go overboard with hating those movies, pretty much like like that kind of stuff. And that's kind of how it is, like, with a lot of fandoms, where you have like the people who go overboard on defending the bad movies, or who go overboard on hating the bad movies, or whether or not there's even bad movies at all. I don't know, it doesn't really matter. I love The Last Jedi, but I've gotten tired of hearing people who hate it and people who just go out of their way to defend it for every little thing. And I say that as someone who thinks The Last Jedi is one of the best Star Wars movies. But again, that's just an idea. With anime, it's a little harder to pin it down that way as to why it bothers me. But I do know that one of the things that has bothered me for years is how much a lot of the people who love anime here more than me seem to think that when it comes to anime movies, it's pretty much all Miyazaki or Studio Ghibli. I mean, most of the time they seem to think that Studio Ghibli means Miyazaki, which I'm like, yeah, I mean, Miyazaki does a lot of stuff with Studio Ghibli, but that doesn't mean everything coming out of Studio Ghibli is Miyazaki. And that's pretty much what's really annoyed me for years, is like, it feels like a lot of the love and respect that is given towards anime is only given specifically to Miyazaki. And as I've talked about with other movies that have appeared on this podcast before, there are other filmmakers out there. There are other people who make movies in Japan. There are other studios. Case in point, Suzume is not a Studio Ghibli movie. It is not a Miyazaki movie. Don't think I've heard that many people mistake it for one, but then again, I've seen it with other movies where they assume, like, oh yeah, that's a Studio Ghibli movie. I mean, just for example, on one of the things I've done a show before on is The Deer King, where a lot of people assume it's a Studio Ghibli film. And from my understanding, it was from a company founded by people who worked for Ghibli at one point, but that doesn't mean that it is Ghibli. You wouldn't call DreamWorks a Disney company, even though it was founded by someone who was the head of Disney Animation at one point. It's just annoying. Before we get started, I just want to say, if you're listening to this on YouTube, go ahead and give it a like, subscribe to the channel, feel free to comment, and ring the bell for notifications. Also, if you're on Spotify or just any other podcast site, follow this show on those platforms. So, Suzume is a movie about a girl who encounters a mysterious person as they're looking for some ruins, or more specifically, a door within ruins. And as a result, it's pretty much like, okay, there's a mysterious thing about this door, it's just right there. And the main character, Suzume, while wondering what's going on, decides to explore it, accidentally unleashes a spirit, and as a result, there's a lot of danger in Japan. Essentially, from my understanding, this is based off of a lot of, like, the disasters in Japan, like the earthquakes and stuff like that. Basically giving it reason within a lot of spiritual stuff. Essentially, there's this whole thing where it's like a worm that's coming out of these doors, because there's a lot of doors all around that are just needing to be closed. And the guy that she encountered was in charge of closing them. He was known as a closer. Guy's name is Soda, and it gets very weird. I'm not sure how much I want to really get into with the plot, just because it is one, it's a very good movie that you definitely should watch, and two, it's just one of those things where it's very strange. So I kind of feel like if I explain it, I'm gonna have to go detail by detail, but it is definitely a worthwhile watching. And like, if you've seen anything from it, you've probably already seen that there's a whole storyline regarding one of the characters, the Soda character. This is very early on, so it's not like a major spoiler. Gets turned into a chair, and the chair ends up being something very important to the main character. You'll eventually see why in the movie, but that's generally what it is. It's like, so he gets turned into a chair. You see him running around as a chair, talking as a chair. It sounds bizarre, but it is neat, and the animation on it is incredible. The fact that they make a chair into a very compelling animated character is impressive. But that's generally what the movie is. Like, okay, so they're closing these doors. There's this spirit who's on the loose. If they don't close these doors, then disaster strikes, like earthquakes, tsunamis, whatever. And Suzume and Soda, who's now turned into a chair, had to stop it, especially because with Soda being a chair, it's harder for him to fully do it, even though he eventually starts learning how to move around as a chair. And a lot of it is just seeing Suzume as she travels around looking for these things, while also trying to help him get his own body back, encountering various people and seeing her relationship with them. It's very much like a coming of age story, which is again weird when you consider it like, okay, you got a chair, you got spirits, all this stuff. So it always feels very human, despite the very supernatural storyline going on. You also get a whole thing with the mother, where we learn the tragic backstory. Suzume currently lives with her aunt, and there's a whole story there too. It's very complex, but it is a very fast-paced story, because this movie's like around 2 hours, and it never really feels that long. At most, I will say that there's a point towards the middle of the movie where it almost feels like, I don't want to say like it shifts into a different movie, but it feels like, I don't know how to put it, but it is weird. Like, it almost feels like the movie kind of finishes one story and then it goes to another story, even though the movie is still technically building off of and answering stuff from the first half of the movie. It's, I don't know, I guess it's one of those things where it's like, so much of American animation has had this very, I don't want to say rigid, but it kind of feels like that's the right word, rigid way of telling stories, that it almost feels like, okay, you already finished telling the story, but so many answers were left unanswered, so we kind of had to continue it on. It feels like the kind of thing where they would have either done a cliffhanger or maybe even just left it closed, and we'd re-enter it in a sequel to fully grasp. As weird as that sounds, but I don't know. I feel like if you watch the movie, you might kind of understand what I'm getting at. Where it's like the first half of the movie is a specific journey across like all these doors, and then by the second half, because of some tragedy that strikes and emotional tragedy within Suzume's life, it almost becomes like, okay, this portion is focused on the road trip adventure. This one's still a road trip adventure, but with a much more different focus. Whereas before it was just about closing these doors to keep things safe. Now we're digging deep into the characters, I guess is what I can say. I don't know. It's kind of weird, but I did kind of notice, like, once it hit that point in the movie, I was just like, I don't know, it's weird. Like, you would think that that's where the story would end, because it's like a big moment, and there's like a big sacrifice. But it's like we still haven't learned everything, so we still have like a good chunk of the movie to go, where we're learning a bit more about what's going on, and there's a bit of a redemption. It's definitely a different mood, but not in a way that it ever feels like it's wrong for the story. It just feels like, and this is the reason why it's important to watch a lot of movies, especially outside the US, if you're into this stuff, you get to realize like how different cultures and countries approach storytelling. Like I said, if this was an American feature, it probably would have ended where you get that big sacrifice and they would have had a big, sad farewell, and we would have, just left feeling like, okay, that was sad, but it was necessary and it was all good. And if they made a sequel, it would probably delve into just the latter half of the story, where it's like, okay, let's try to find more of the backstory, whether or not that tragedy is gonna be resolved in some way, just stuff like that. I feel like, or maybe I'm just being crazy and I don't understand. So, as mentioned before, this is not a Studio Ghibli film. This is a movie directed by, and I hope I'm saying this right, Makoto Shinkai, who has previously done other movies. I feel like a lot of American audiences would probably know Your Name, because I know that was a pretty big animated film a few years back. I know they've been talking about doing a remake for it for years. It's one I definitely got to talk about it someday. But in comparison, I think I kind of prefer this one over that one, just because of the more fantastical elements. I do like that you have the spirit that's being chased around as a cat, who reminds me a lot of the Cheshire Cat. It's the character's name is Daijin, and it's a little shit. I feel like anyone who watches this movie is automatically gonna want to punch this cat, as adorable as it is. But every time you hear that high pitch Suzume, I kept on thinking like, ah, shit, this motherfucker's right in here, and he's gonna ruin some shit. But it is a fun character, and I do like how it eventually goes back that whole thing. I do like the fact that, and again, this is more of a Japanese thing I've noticed, where it's like, okay, at first you're thinking like, okay, this is just a straight up villain. And just to be clear, I love a lot of villains and a lot of Western stuff, but it is nice to get some variety, where it's like, with this, it's like, okay, yeah, it's a villain, and in a sense that he's messing around with the main characters, but as the movie progresses, and again, this is why I feel like this would be different if it was an American thing, is that like for a good chunk of it you're thinking like, okay, so he's just taunting the main characters, and then once that big tragic sacrifice happens towards the middle of the movie, you kind of realize like, okay, there is more complexity to this character than we initially thought, and it's not really evil, it's just kind of playful and not fully aware of like the effects of his actions, or aware of it but not fully aware of like the emotional impact that it's having on the main character. But he is an adorable little shit stain, and just stuff like that I think made it more fun for me than something like Your Name, which I thought was a very good emotional story. But again, I just like the more fantastical stuff. I'm not really going to compare these two because they're one different movies. I'm just saying in comparison to like which one I liked more. I will have to talk about Your Name just to fully get into it. But yeah, very solid movie with a lot of solid visuals. The animation on this is top notch. It's one of those things where you get a lot of people who are like, oh, we want 2D back. And, I agree. I want 2D back as a big thing in the US, especially with feature films. The problem is that a lot of people, when they say that, they mean we want it back for Disney, which I get it. I do want Disney to do 2D films, but Disney is not the only studio that exists out there. And when there's a lot of foreign features that are doing 2D, especially with Japan, a lot of these anime movies have been coming out in theaters, and they've been doing pretty well more and more as time goes on. I really wish more studios would try to push them even further, try to get them to have much more wider releases, longer releases, because some of these only last for a couple of weeks. I don't know. It'd be nice if people supported these more, and that would kind of get the ball rolling to have more studios be more confident, even if Disney themselves just don't want to bother with it. Which if they don't, you know what, their loss. We gotta accept that Disney is not the end all be all of animation. There's other people, and we gotta support whoever's doing these things. Like if we want 2D animation to thrive, and we see these movies coming out, by all means support them. I mean, if you have no interest in whatever movie is out that's 2D, I understand that. You know, your money is important, and you should support whatever you want to support. I'm just saying, like, if you be honest, like, do you actually want 2D movies to come back, or do you just want Disney to make 2D movies? Because that's two completely different things, and fortunately, a lot of you seem to only want it from Disney, since you don't seem to even offer up the chance to these movies. Me personally, I did want to see this one in theaters when it came out. Unfortunately, it did not release with a lot of time. Like, pretty much, like, 90% of the time for me when it comes to these kinds of movies, it's the schedule. Whether it's I get too busy with my life, or they don't really give them a whole lot of screenings, which I remember this one being a case like that, where it's like it didn't really have that many screenings, it didn't really line up with my own schedule. The same thing kind of happened recently with the Spy Family movie. I'm not a fan of the Spy Family anime, but I was like, you know what? I've watched a lot of these anime movies when they come out on theaters, if I get the chance, just because I'm like, look, it's 2D, it's nice, and even beyond the animation, factor, I do want studios to start considering to have a lot of foreign features, play regularly in American cinemas, because it's kind of weird how, a lot of people talk about like how great, foreign films are, and then that's also the thing. It's like a lot of these movies barely get a push in America, to the point where it's like, they don't really get screenings at all, or if they do, it's very limited. And it would be nice if a country that loves movies so much would actually take the time to be like, okay, let's release our movies too, but we can release those and have them get healthy screenings. There's a lot of people who would be willing to watch these things if we did the proper thing, which, as much as some people might not like it, that means that yes, we do have to have more dubs happen. Because look, I understand reading. I love watching things in their original language, and I don't mind reading subtitles, but it is kind of hard sometimes for some people. It's something that you have to accept. So if the option is there, it's nice. I mean, a lot of these movies, I've noticed, like, even with as limited screenings as they do have a, like, for example, like a Japanese with subtitle screening and an English screening. Me personally, I try to watch a lot of these in the original language, but when it comes to doing the show, I've become more adapted to watching it in English. One, because it makes it easier, especially when it gives me time to watch it, so I don't have to worry about constantly stopping something if I get lost with some of the reading. And also because sometimes I'm taking notes on these things, and it just makes it easier to follow that way. And again, a lot of these have had good dubs. Like, I feel like a lot of people over exaggerate on the bad dubs. They're either thinking of stuff that came out decades ago that was poorly dubbed, or they're thinking of some other foreign feature that got lost in translation. We've seen a lot of those when it comes to different languages where they make animated films and they're comedies, so they have to adjust to American audiences, and as a result, they end up putting in a bunch of random ass pop culture references that were never there to begin with, and the humor is completely lost. I don't see that with a lot of anime anymore, if at all. And I think people love to say it's a thing that happens, even though it's not a thing that happens, or if it does, it barely happens. And I feel it's disingenuous to say, oh yeah, this is why I don't like dubs. And again, if you want to watch it in its original language, I get it. I watched a lot of these things in the original language too. When I'm not doing it for the show, I tend to watch it in its original language. But you do have to understand that it is an option, and it's not a bad option for people to have. And of course, for as much as people love to say they champion voice actors, this is one of those things where you got like people who are clearly being hypocrites about it. And sure, sometimes with these dubs, they do get celebrity voice actors, or like smaller celebrities, just because they're like, okay, well, we gotta sell the movie. But in many cases, they do have actual voice actors come in big roles. And it tends to how I feel like the whole dub versus sub thing gets so overblown, and it's like, watch it the way you want. Bad dubs exist, but you know, things have gotten better, and as long as the dub delivers what is needed to be done, I feel like it shouldn't be a problem. I don't think. Yeah, overall, great movie. I think the animation is definitely some of the best I've seen in recent memory, just because it's very beautiful and very well done. Okay, let me rephrase that. Even within a bunch of great animation that I've seen from anime, I think this is some of the neater looking ones in terms of like stuff that's fairly recent. I saw The Boy and the Heron, wonderful movie. I've seen stuff like The Deer King. I saw Belle. Of them, I think visually this is the one that looks the best to me. I know there's gonna be some weird stuff throughout the movie that might bother some audiences, mainly in terms of the fact that the main character is 17 and the Soda character is older, and it never goes too sexual or anything like that, but you kind of get the hints of a romance. Just because she does set on him and intentionally kind of teases him over it, stuff like that, where people might feel a bit uncomfortable. Japan has different things. That's all I'm gonna say. You're not wrong to feel uncomfortable if that's not your kind of thing, but just have that in your mind before you start going off on anything that might be bigoted or just insulting. But overall, it's nothing to be too offended by. They never go too far with it, so it's not like it's that bothersome. But it is something where every time I came up, I was kind of laughing a little bit just because I'm like, oh yeah, that would not fly over here. But it's okay. It's nothing to be too bothered by. It doesn't do anything offensive. It doesn't do anything insulting. Guys, different cultures exist, so we do gotta respect it, as weird as it might be for us, and as funny as it could be for us to realize, like, hey, that wouldn't work here. I don't know. Wonderful time. Definitely recommended. I have nothing else to say, at least not that I can think of right now. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.
Suzume, I like you. Lots. Goodbye.
Thanks for stopping by. Go ahead and follow this channel. Subscribe, like, and comment. Ring the bell for notifications. Go ahead and also follow my podcast. And give some love to my Patreon account while you're at it. It's www.patreon.com/saicams. Again, thanks for stopping by, and I hope you come back for more in the future.